Thank you, David. Well, as you just heard, I'm going to take you back to where it all started. The tank is an invention, British invention, and it comes out of the carnage of the Western Front in the First World War. It's very appropriate we are here, because since 1916, Bovington has been the centre of tank training for the British Army. A lot of those first tank crews were trained here, and then the vehicles were deployed to the Western Front. And that's exactly what we've been doing ever since. So, First World War. Well, the first thing to tell you about this, if you didn't know already, is the First World War didn't turn out like anybody was expecting it to. What they were expecting was mobile warfare, like every war there'd ever been. So, you have infantry, cavalry, artillery, the three fighting arms. Armies move around the landscape. Where they bump into one another, that's where you have a battle. That, of course, does not happen after the first few weeks. It degenerates into a stalemate. Trench warfare. This strip of ravaged land all the way from Nieuwpoort on the Belgian coast right the way down to the Swiss border. And now, if you want to attack the enemy, you've got to get through that somehow. Now, the things that dominate the battlefield in the First World War, basically three. One is barbed wire. Barbed wire in unimaginable quantities. And it's not like modern barbed wire. Anybody can climb over a modern barbed wire fence. This stuff, the barbs are twice as long, and there are probably 3 times as many. And just over here, we have our barbed wire entanglement. Trying to get through that is incredibly difficult in itself. The second thing is artillery, and the entire area is smashed up, ravaged by colossal quantities of artillery rounds that have been dropped into no man's land and its hinterland. And the third thing is the machine gun. Now, the machine gun is coming into its own. It's a very effective weapon, 450 rounds a minute, belt-fed, and that combination produces absolute carnage on the battlefield. Now, behind me, you'll see there is German trench system. There's a sandbagged emplacement, and there is a bunker, what they call a mebu. By the middle of the war, the trench is starting almost to cease to be a fighting platform. A lot of the fighting is done from concrete shelters. Now, we want to attack. Our infantry from the West Kents is going to go forward, and they are going to try and get through the barbed wire and take that trench system. But first of all, we're going to rough up the enemy with an artillery bombardment. Now, over on my right-hand side, there is an 18-pounder gun. That is an original gun, very, very rare thing in itself. Over 100 years old, and he's going to fire a series of rounds, what we call a walking barrage, across the battlefield. Fire mission, all done. 1 round fired. He's now going to adjust his aim slightly, raise his aim, and he's going to walk the barrage forward. And by this, he aims to do 2 things. Smash the barbed wire, cut the barbed wire, and kill the enemy. Another round in. Now, the scale of this is unbelievable. Just that one gun, the 18-pounder, in 4 years they produced 113 million 18-pounder shells, mostly shrapnel. 113 million shells, and they used 99.8 million. That's an unbelievable amount of metal. The Somme bombardment, the bombardment that took place before the opening of the Battle of the Somme, took a week. We plastered the German lines for a solid week with artillery fire. 1.5 million shells of all calibers. And the thought was, there won't be a German soldier left alive. Their positions will be wrecked. Even if they're hiding down in deep shelters, they'll be so concussed they won't be able to do anything without it. To a certain extent, this was true. German troops did suffer, and they did die. They called it Trommelfeuer, drum fire, the sheer concussion of shells landing. But when the barrage lifts, there are enough of them left to come back up to the surface and man their machine guns. West Kent's coming forward, led by their officer. They are deploying a little bit of smoke to give them a fighting chance. but the barrage hasn't worked. The machine gun, MG08 machine gun, 450 rounds a minute, and he's going to be ripping into the advancing British infantry, scything across the battlefield. They're taking casualties already, they're being cut to pieces, and the barbed wire is still intact. It's incredibly difficult to cut barbed wire by artillery fire alone. The shell fusing wasn't right. High explosive shells dropped through the wire, cratered the ground beneath, but left the wire itself intact. Now the West Kents, they're putting up a game effort, they're firing back at the machine gun. But an SMLE will fire 18 rounds a minute, a machine gun will fire 450. That is not an even contest. And they've thought better of it, they've taken severe casualties, they're moving back into cover. So, that is round one to Das Hier, the German army. This is a reenactment, but if you think about the real thing, first day of the Battle of the Somme, 58,000 casualties, of whom 20,000 were killed in a few short hours. And of course, most of the battlefield, very little progress. So, we need something new. We need new invention. We need a machine gun destroyer. And here she comes. This is a British Mark IV tank. This is a replica. We can't drive the originals. They are being dragged along. She's quite slow. On the road, probably 4 miles an hour. Off-road, probably 2. But that doesn't matter because she's coming forward. The infantry are following behind. This is a male tank, so she has a pair of 6-pounder guns, and she's coming forward just like an armoured steamroller. She's going to crash through the wall. The enemy machine gun team is getting a bit desperate. They're firing back. Rounds are bouncing off. There's nothing to stop this hideous metal monster. German soldiers, tough guys, panic when they see tanks for the first time. One German Unteroffizier, a senior engineer, absolutely lost it, ran away shouting, "There's a crocodile crawling into our trench." They'd never seen anything like it. Not through the wire. She's pulling round for a shot at the machine gun post. The West Kents are moving forward. By this time of the war, the infantry have learnt quite a lot, and they're practicing fire and movement. The Mark IV has scored a hit on the machine gun post. It's knocked out the machine gun. And the infantry are going forward to take the position. They're keeping firing. By this time of the war, by 1917, we don't go forward in long straight lines. We practice fire and movement. We've learned a lot. The infantry are pepper potting. You've got 2 half sections going forward, one providing covering fire, the other advancing. And they're moving up to take the enemy front line. Doesn't look like there's much resistance anymore. They're going to move up. They're taking things a bit carefully because you never know what's waiting for you. Putting a few rounds down. The machine gun has certainly been knocked out. Don't know if there's any life in that bunker behind. Moving up to the final assault, you'd probably chuck a few grenades in, just to make absolutely certain. Position clear. We have taken the enemy front line. The West Kents have done their stuff. And then just to prove it, up comes the Union Jack. The tank, the infantry and the artillery together, this has been a very successful operation. This is what we move on to. This is called combined arms warfare. The only thing we're missing is aircraft. They were also used. But there we have it. The German front line is taken. Now, the German army first seized the tank on the Somme in September of 1916. And the German army is never very long on the back foot. So they're immediately thinking about, okay, well, small arms fire won't work. What can we do to take these things on? And they realised that artillery, their artillery, if you go to the museum, you'll see we have the Graincourt gun. We've got a 77mm field gun. One of those things will smash a tank into flaming scrap metal very easily indeed. The armour on these things, it's about 12mm. It will not stop an artillery round. They also adapt French mortars to fire horizontally, almost a bit like a sort of crude bazooka. They come up with armour-piercing rounds, SMK rounds, Schmidt-Kerr. But the German infantry needs something to hit back with. I'm going to walk over here now to talk to an expert, Stalemate, about an extraordinary weapon, something called the Tiger, the tank. While I'm picking my way forward, you may see we've got some vehicular assistance. We've got a Model T Ford, and we've also got an American 1917-18 Liberty truck. These are original vehicles, original engines. They are very, very rare things in themselves. The British Army is one of the most mechanised of the lot during the First World War. David, good morning. Good to see you again. You've got something with shirts. You've got a T-Gewehr. Would you like to tell us a little about it?
Yeah, the T-Gewehr was basically the Germans' answer to an anti-tank rifle. They basically found that normal rifle rounds were incapable of penetrating a tank, so they decided they would make a high-velocity round, and eventually it would end up in an oversized rifle, such as the T-Gewehr. It was late production, it didn't come out really till early February 18. It was first seen on the battlefield, but really and truly mass production started in May of 1918. So it didn't have a long life, but it managed to produce 14,500 or so by the end of the First World War.
It is a massive elephant gun affair. It's 13.2mm. That's bigger than 50 cal. And originally, the idea was the 13.2mm round was going to be used in a machine gun, a T or F-Gewehr, Tank und Fliegergewehr. So they could hose down aircraft, hose down tanks. That didn't work, so they gave the round to Mauser and said, build a bolt-action rifle. Something simple the infantry could use around this. And it is an absolute monster. Our Lancer, our infantry, are going to fire the T-Gewehr. To give you an idea, it's pretty loud. Originally, the recoil was horrific, it really was. It's a single-shot bolt-action weapon. I'm going to move away slightly because it's going to be pretty loud. That is the sound of a 13.2mm round. That, of course, is a blank, so there's no recoil. But the recoil on this thing was absolutely sickening, it really was. German soldiers were only allowed to fire 3 rounds, and they had to pass it to somebody else, because the recoil gave you whiplash. You're in danger of dislodging parts of your eye. It really was a hideous, unforgiving weapon. Against tanks, well, you think about it, that's a big round, but it's basically one big bullet. How much effect is that going to have on a tank? You've got to hit something absolutely vital in order to have any effect at all. I think they were probably more often used in shooting out things like trench plates in tanks, in enemy trenches. But they're There are quite a few around. There's such strange weapons that quite a few were taken home as souvenirs. Most British regimental museums will have at least one, possibly more, Tigavers in their stores, if not on display. Now, the other thing that is lumbering, and these tanks are all very slow indeed, from behind the stands, is an A7V Sturmpanzer. This again is a replica. There's only one of these things left, and in tank warfare you usually think about tanks fighting other tanks. That really doesn't happen in the First World War. There's one instance when at a place called Villas Bretonneau, an three A7Vs in fact, come across a British Mark V tank. The A7V is really not an outstanding design. Not even the Germans thought much of it. Von Ludendorff said, well, we built these things, don't expect they'll be much good, but I suppose we ought to use them. It is massive. You look at the size of it. This is a scale replica. It's got a Nordenfeldt gun in the front, and then it would have secondary armament in the form of machine guns, MG08s like the ones you've seen firing, in embrasures around the side. 18-man crew, 18 men in one tank. It's a ludicrous object, and the other thing about it is that it tended to fall over on rough ground. Now, if you think about that, it's not an ideal tank characteristic. The German war machine only produced 20 A7Vs. There's one left, it's in Australia, so you have to go to the Australian War Memorial collection to go and see it, which is why we've got our replica here. But the funny thing is, the Germans had far more tanks than that, because they reused British tanks. After the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, there are quite a number of British tanks broken down on the battlefield. And the German army picks them up, calls them Beutepanzer, rearms them, paints iron crosses on the side, and sends them back against us. Now, when I first worked at the museum a number of years ago, we used to do a lot of talks in our Mark IV tank, because this, if you're lucky, this is the one place in the world you can actually get inside a First World War tank. And I used to say, well, this is the tank that more British tank crew went to war in, and more German tank crew went to war in than any other, because they only had 20 Beutepanzers. They had a running fleet, beg your pardon, only had 20 A7Vs. They had a running fleet of about 100 Beutepanzer, mostly British Mark IVs. When you see these things moving around, because the Mark IV is going to set off and the infantry are going to follow behind, as they would have at the time, the speed is completely authentic. These are not like modern tanks. They are not fast-moving weapons of manoeuvre. They are very slow. Like I said, with Mark IV, on the road it'll hum along 4 miles an hour, across country it's about 2. So in a sense, I tend to think of these things as not exactly being tanks, so much as a bit like a medieval siege tower. So the tank's job is to go forward, let the infantry follow behind, crush the wire, and then use its armament to take out machine guns. Mark IV is about to move off. When she does, just look at the way she moves. This might be a replica, but I've seen the real thing. I've seen our Mark V moving, and the way she moves is absolutely authentic. The way she moves, the way she lumbers along, the way she turns. That is what a British First World War tank authentically looked like. And do go into the museum. In my opinion, our First World War hall is probably the best bit of the place. When you're in this museum, if you take the Renault FT, the little French thing, out of the equation, you're in the presence of about 80% of all the surviving First World War armour on the planet. Tank warfare does, of course, progress. The first time we use tanks is on the Somme, and we've only got about a dozen to deploy, and they cause terror, but they don't achieve anything much. Most of them break down. But then we go on, and the battle that I mentioned earlier, Battle of Cambrai, that is in November 1917. It's really the battle that the Royal Tank Regiment, and you'll see some of those guys around here today, take their history from. And that is the first massive use of tanks. 420 odd tanks, preceded by an artillery barrage, followed by infantry, covered by aircraft, real combined arms stuff, go forward, and they smash a hole in the German front line. And this is the Siegfriedstellung, the Hindenburg line, the toughest bit of their defences. And they smash a hole in that, 6 miles wide and 4 miles deep. And that's where the tank comes of age, and it's certainly where the Royal Tank Regiment takes its tradition from. And if you do go into the Tank Story Hall, we have the original RTR flag, or Royal Tank Corps flag. It's made of 3 colours, 3 bits of silk, it's the only stuff they could get at the time. And they are brown, red and green. Through mud and blood to the green fields beyond. Right, so that is your introduction to tank and anti-tank warfare in the First World War. I am going to hand you back to Mr. Steve Bully, and we're going to move on in history. Thank you very much.
Well done, Chris, fantastic, and great to see your amazing knowledge of all of those bits of armoury that we've seen in the main arena. It's wonderful to see such an eclectic mix, and you'll see much more as the day goes on. Just a couple of quick reminders. I do sound like my mum now, like a nagger. But if you're going to want to stand up, there is a standing area which is to my left, to your right, if you're looking at me at the moment. Please don't stand at the front by the brick wall, because you obscure the view from the people behind you, and everyone wants to see the very best vantage point possible. If you want to nip down and take a photograph, that's fine, but just sort of get down on your knees and take your picture and then move on. Now, not only is there amazing events taking place here in the main arena across the day, but there's loads more for you to go and see, and do make sure that you explore the whole of the area. Chris has just been talking about some of the amazing displays inside the Tank Museum. If you need to cool off for a short while, grab some water and have a wander around inside in the Tank Museum. We've also got our living history area, which is beyond the Vehicle Conservation Centre. And of course, if you haven't already done so, make sure you pop into the Tank Museum shop and get your Tank Museum Tankfest merch for this year. I know they did good trade in there yesterday's. If you want to grab a show programme, that gives you the full guide of exactly what's happening, when and where. And we've got some really authoritative speakers speaking on the lecture stage. The lecture stage is just beyond the Vehicle Conservation Centre, which you can't miss, because it's a big building and it says Vehicle Conservation Centre on it.